Heinrich Wölfflin. Section 2. The Swiss Revolt. Switzerland, though nominally a part of the empire, had long been practically independent. Its 13 cantons were united in a loose confederacy, each being practically a self-governing republic. The land, as a whole, was deemed the freest in Europe. Its sons were in great repute as soldiers and were eagerly sought as mercenaries, particularly by the kings of France and the popes. Though the general status of education was low, humanism had penetrated the larger towns, and in the early decades of the 16th century had notably its home in Basel. The Swiss Reformation was to have its sources in humanism, in local self-government, in hatred of ecclesiastical restraint, and in resistance to monastic exactions, especially where the monasteries were large landowners. Huldreich Zwingli, chief of the reformers of German-speaking Switzerland, was born on January 1, 1484, in Wildhaus, where his father was the bailiff of the village and in comfortable circumstances. An uncle, the Dean of Wiesen, started him on the road to an education, which was continued in Basel, and then in Bern under the humanist Heinrich Wölfflin, Lupulus, from 1498 to 1500. For 2 years Zwingli was a student in the University of Vienna, where Konrad Keltz had great fame in the classics. From 1502 to 1506 he continued his studies in the University of Basel, graduating as Bachelor of Arts in 1504, and receiving the master's degree 2 years later. At Basel he enjoyed the instruction of the humanist Thomas Wittenbach, 1472 to 1526, whom he gratefully remembered as having taught him the sole authority of Scripture, the death of Christ as the only price of forgiveness, and the worthlessness of indulgences. Under such teaching Zwingli became naturally a humanist himself, eager to go back to the earlier sources of Christian belief, and critical of what the humanists generally deemed superstition. He never passed through the deep spiritual experience of sin and forgiveness that came to Luther. His religious attitude was always more intellectual and radical than that of the Saxon reformer. The year of Zwingli's second graduation saw his appointment, apparently through the influence of his clerical uncle, as parish priest in Glarus. Here he studied Greek, became an influential preacher, opposed the employment of Swiss as mercenaries, saved by the Pope, and in 1513 received a pension from the Pope, anxious to secure the continued military support of the Swiss. He accompanied the young men of his parish as chaplain in several Italian campaigns. He corresponded with Erasmus and other humanists. His knowledge of the world was increasing, and he touched life on many sides. Zwingli was patriotically convinced of the moral evil of mercenary service, but the French, eager to enlist Swiss soldiers, made so much trouble in his Glarus parish that, without resigning the post, he transferred his activities in 1516 to the still famous pilgrim shrine of Einsiedeln. The change brought him enlarged reputation as a preacher and a student. To this Einsiedeln sojourn Zwingli, always jealous of admitting indebtedness to Luther, later ascribed his acceptance of the evangelical position. The evidence that has survived points, however, to little then beyond the more advanced humanistic attitude. His own life at this time was, moreover, not free from reproach for breach of the vow of chastity. His opposition to foreign military service and reputation as a preacher and scholar led to Zwingli's election by the Minster chapter in Zurich as people's priest, an office on which he entered with the commencement of 1519. He began at once the orderly exposition of whole books of the Bible, commencing with Matthew's Gospel. He now became acquainted with Luther's writings. He was brought near to death by the plague. He preached faithfully against mercenary soldiering, so that Zurich ultimately, May, 1521, forbade the practice. His own spiritual life deepened, through bereave. At the cantonal civil authorities practically rejected the jurisdiction of the bishop and took the control of the Zurich churches into their own hands. In the August following the Zurich burgomaster laid down the rule that the pure word of God was alone to be preached, and the road to revolution was thus fully open. Zwingli believed that the ultimate authority was the Christian community, and that the exercise of that authority was through the duly constituted organs of civil government acting in accordance with the Scriptures. Only that which the Bible commands, or for which distinct authorization can be found in its pages, is binding or allowable. Hence his attitude toward the ceremonies and order of the older worship was much more radical than that of Luther. Really, the situation in Zurich was one in which the cantonal government introduced the changes which Zwingli, as a trusted interpreter of scripture and a natural popular leader, persuaded that government to sanction. Zwingli now began a process of governmental and popular education, which he employed with great success. Persuaded by Zwingli, the cantonal government ordered a public discussion, in January, 1523, in which the Bible only should be the touchstone. For this debate Zwingli prepared 67 brief articles, affirming that the gospel derives no authority from the Church, that salvation is by faith, and denying the sacrificial character of the Mass, the salvatory character of good works, the value of saintly intercessors, the binding character of monastic vows, or the existence of purgatory. He also declared Christ to be the sole head of the Church, and advocated clerical marriage. In the resulting debate the government declared Zwingli the victor, in that it affirmed that he had not been convicted of heresy, and directed that he should continue his preaching. It was an endorsement of his teaching. Changes now went rapidly. Priests and nuns married. Fees for baptisms and burials were done away. In a second great debate, in October, 1523, Zwingli and his associate minister, Leo Judd, 1482–1542, attacked the use of images and the sacrificial character of the Mass. The government was with them, but moved cautiously. January, 1524, saw a third great debate. The upholders of the old order were given choice of conformity or banishment. In June and July, 1524, images, relics, and organs were done away. December witnessed the confiscation of the monastic establishments, their property being wisely used, in large part, in the establishment of excellent schools. The Mass continued till Holy Week of 1525, when it too was abolished. The transformation was complete. Episcopal jurisdiction had been thrown off, the services put into German, the sermon made central, the characteristic doctrines and ceremonies of the older worship done away. 1 Meanwhile, on April 2, 1524, Zwingli had publicly married Anna Reinhard, a widow, whom he and his friends, not without considerable unfriendly gossip, had treated as in some sense his wife since 1522. All this time the popes had made no effective interference in Zurich affairs, largely by reason of the political value of Switzerland in the wars. The Bishop of Constance had done what he could, but to no avail. Naturally Zwingli followed with eagerness the fortunes of the ecclesiastical revolution in other parts of Switzerland and the adjacent regions of Germany, and aided it to the utmost of his ability. Basel, where the civil authority had gained large influence in churchly affairs before the revolt, was won gradually for the evangelical cause, chiefly by Johann Siculampadius, 1482–1531, who labored there continuously from 1522. There the Mass was abolished in 1529. Ecolampadius and Zwingli were warm friends. Bern, the greatest of the Swiss cantons, was won for the reform in 1528, after much preliminary evangelical labor, by a public debate in which Zwingli took part. St. Gallen, Schaffhausen, Glarus, and Milhausen in Alsace. Tidily and frequently, he gave the Augustinian answer. Luther's interest was much more in the how. To Zwingli the will of God rather than the way of salvation was the central fact of theology. To Luther the Christian life was one of freedom in forgiven sonship. To Zwingli it was far more one of conformity to the will of God as set forth in the Bible. Zwingli's nature was intellectual and critical. In no point of Christian doctrine was his diversity from Luther more apparent than in their unlike interpretation of the Lord's Supper, and here their disagreement unfortunately ultimately sundered the evangelical ranks. To Luther Christ's words, "This is my body," were literally true. His deep religious feeling saw in an actual partaking of Christ the surest pledge of that union with Christ and forgiveness of sins of which the supper was the divinely attested promise. But as early as 1521 a Dutch lawyer, Cornelius Hoon, had urged that the proper interpretation is, "This signifies my body." Hoon's argument came to Zwingli's notice in 1523, and confirmed the symbolic understanding of the words to which the Swiss theologian was already inclined. Henceforth he denied any physical presence of Christ in the supper, and emphasized its memorial character and its significance as uniting a congregation of believers in a common attestation of loyalty to their Lord. By 1524 the rival interpretations had led to an embittered controversy of pamphlets in which Luther and Bugenhagen on the one side and Zwingli and Gycolampadius on the other, and their respective associates, took part. The most important work of Luther's was his great Confession Concerning the Lord's Supper, of 1528. Little charity was shown on either side. To Zwingli, Luther's assertion of the physical presence of Christ was an unreasoning remnant of Catholic superstition. A physical body could be only in one place. To Luther, Zwingli's interpretation was a sinful exaltation of reason above Scripture, and he sought to explain the physical presence of Christ on 10,000 altars at once by a scholastic assertion, derived largely from Occam, that the qualities of Christ's divine nature, including ubiquity, were communicated to his human nature. Luther was anxious, also, to maintain that the believer partook of the whole divine human Christ, and to avoid any dismemberment of his person. Luther declared Zwingli and his supporters to be no Christians, while Zwingli affirmed that Luther was worse than the Roman champion, Eck. Zwingli's views, however, met the approval not only of German-speaking Switzerland but of much of southwestern Germany. The Roman party rejoiced at this evident division of the evangelical forces. Zwingli was the most gifted of any of the reformers politically, and developed plans which were far-reaching, though in the end futile. The old rural cantons, Uri, Schwitz, Unterwalden, and Zug, were strongly conservative and opposed to the changes in Zurich, and with them stood Lucerne, the whole constituting a vigorous Roman party. By April, 1524, these had formed a league to resist heresy. To offset this effort and to carry evangelical preaching into yet wider territories, Zwingli now proposed that Zurich enter into alliance with France and Savoy, and began negotiations with the dispossessed Duke Ulrich of Württemberg. Matters drifted along, but a more successful attempt was the organization of the Christian Civic Alliance, late in 1527, between Zurich and Constance. A league to which Bern and St. Gallen were added in 1528, and Biel, Milhausen, Basel, and Schaffhausen in 1529. Though Strasbourg joined early in 1530, the league was far less extensive than Zwingli planned. As it was divisive of Swiss unity, and the conservative Roman cantons formed a counter-Christian union and secured alliance with Austria in 1529. Hostilities were begun. But Austrian help for the Roman party was not forthcoming, and on June 25, 1529, peace was made between the two parties. Ines drawn substantially as they are today. In the leadership of the Zurich Church, not in his political ambitions, Zwingli was succeeded by the able and conciliatory Heinrich Bullinger, 1504–1575. The Swiss movement, as a whole, was to be modified and greatly developed by the genius of Calvin, and to the churches which traced their spiritual parentage to him, and thus in part to Zwingli, the name, Reformed, as distinguished from Lutheran, was ultimately to be given. Section 4. The Anabaptists. It has been said, in speaking of Karlstadt, that some who once worked with Luther came to feel that he was but a halfway reformer. Such was even more largely Zwingli's experience. Among those who had been most forward in favoring innovations in Zurich were Conrad Grebel and Felix Manz, both from prominent families of the city. They and others soon came to feel that Zwingli's leadership in the application of the biblical test to Zurich practices was far too conservative. This element first came into evidence at the Second Great Debate, in October, 1523, page 362, where it demanded the immediate abolition of images and of the Mass steps for which the cantonal authorities were not as yet fully ready. An abler participant in that debate was Balthasar Hubmaier, 1480–1528, once a pupil, then colleague and friend of Luther's opponent, Eck, but now preacher in Waldstadt, on the northern edge of Switzerland. Led to evangelical views by Luther's writings in 1522, he was successfully urging reform in his city. As early as May, 1523, he had come to doubt infant baptism, and had discussed it with Zwingli, who, according to his testimony, then sympathized with him. His criticisms were based on want of scriptural warrant for administration to infants. By 1524 Grebel and Manz had reached the same conclusion. But it was not till early in 1525 that they or Hubmaier translated theory into practice. Their criticisms led, in January, 1525, to a public debate with Zwingli, as a consequence of which the cantonal authorities of Zurich ordered all children baptized there had evidently been delay on the part of some parents and in particular directed Grebel and Mans to cease from disputing, and banished the priest of Wittichen, Wilhelm Riebli. To these men this seemed a command by an earthly power to act counter to the word of God. They and some of their friends gathered in a private house in Zolliken, near Zurich, on February 7, 1525, and their Mans, or George Blaurock, once a monk, instituted believers' baptism by sprinkling. A few weeks later a case of immersion occurred, and after Easter, Hubmaier was baptized in Waldshut by Riebli. These acts constituted the group's separate communions. By their opponents they were nicknamed Anabaptists or rebaptizers. Really, since they denied the validity of their baptism in infancy, the name was inappropriate, and Baptists would be the truer designation, but as a title consecrated by long usage to a remarkable movement of the Reformation age, the more common name is convenient. The Zurich government, in March, 1526, ordered Anabaptists drowned, in hideous parody of their belief, and a few months later Mans thus suffered martyrdom. Zwingli opposed them with much bitterness, but with little success in winning them from their position. In Waldshut Hubmaier soon gathered a large Anabaptist community, and was even more successful in propagating his opinions by his pen. In his view the Bible is the sole law of the Church, and according to the scriptural test the proper order of Christian development is, preaching the word, hearing, belief, baptism, works, the latter indicating a life lived with the Bible as its law. Waldshut, however, was soon involved in the peasant revolt, in how far through Hubmaier is doubtful, and shared the collapse of that movement. Hubmaier had to fly, and the city was once more Catholic. Imprisoned and tortured in Zurich, he fled to Moravia, where he propagated the Anabaptist move. Tie-ins of baptized experiential Christians united as the body of Christ by common observance of the Lord's Supper, its only weapon is excommunication. Absolute rejection of all servitude of the flesh, such as the worship of the Roman, Lutheran, and Zwinglian churches, is demanded. Each congregation is to choose its own officers, and administer through them its discipline. While civil government is still a necessity in this imperfect world, the Christian should have no share in it, nor should he take any form of oath. Here were ideas which were to be represented, in varying proportions, by later Baptists, Congregationalists, and Quakers, and through them to have a profound influence on the religious development of England and America. The Anabaptist ideal implied a self-governing congregation, independent of state or episcopal control, having the Bible as its law, and living a rather ascetic life of strict conformity to a literal interpretation of supposedly biblical requirements. The sources of these opinions are still in dispute. By some the Anabaptists are regarded as the radicals of the Reformation period, by others as the fruit of new interest in Bible reading by the literal-minded, by still others as revivals of medieval anti-Roman sections. There is truth in all these theories. The Anabaptists themselves had no consciousness of connection with pre-Reformation movements, they made the Bible literally their law, but many of their characteristics are undoubtedly pre-Reformation. Such is their view of the Bible as a new law in church and state, through obedience to which God's favor is to be preserved. They had as little sympathy with Luther's conception of the gospel as summed up in the forgiveness of sins, as with the Roman conception of salvation through the sacraments. Pre-Reformation is their ascetic view of the Christian life. So is their conception of the state as a concession to sin, and unworthy of the participation of a Christian in its administration. Such, also, are their strong apocalyptic and mystical tendencies. The views which have been indicated were those of the overwhelming majority of Anabaptists, but a radical movement attracts extremists, and there were not a few who went much further, but cannot be regarded as representative of the Anabaptists as a whole. Such was the learned humanist Johann Denk, 1527, who taught an inner light superior to all Scripture, saw in Christ only the highest human example of love, and held that the Christian may live without sin. Associated with Denk in these opinions, was the learned Ludwig Hetzer, to whom was due, with Denk's aid, a translation of the Old Testament prophetical books, but who was beheaded for adulteries at Constance in 1529. The radical preacher, Hans Hut, to whose work much of the rapid spread of Anabaptist views among the working classes of South Germany and Austria was due, declared himself a prophet, affirming that persecution of the saints would be immediately followed by the destruction of the empire by the Turks, following which event the saints would be gathered, and by them all priests and unworthy rulers destroyed, whereupon Christ would visibly reign on earth. In Hubmaier, Hutt had a vigorous opponent, but Hutt's preaching ended only with his death, in 1527 in Augsburg, through burns received in an attempt to escape from the prison by setting it afire. Some of the more radical Anabaptist leaders taught community of goods and social revolution. Everywhere the hand of the authorities, Catholic and evangelical, was heavy on the Anabaptists, though most Protestant territories used banishment rather than the death penalty. Their leaders were martyred. In 1527 Mans met death by drowning in Zurich, while Sattler was burned and his wife drowned near Rottenburg. The next year Hubmaier was burned in Vienna and his wife drowned. Blaurock was burned in the Tyrol in 1529. With these leaders perished great numbers of their followers. Yet the movement continued. Emperor's prospects had forbidden further Lutheran advance, and practically ordered the restoration of Roman episcopal authority. The Lutheran minority had protested. In this threatening situation Philip of Hesse had attempted to secure a defensive league of all German and Swiss evangelical forces. The chief hindrances were the doctrinal differences between the two parties, but Philip hoped that they might be adjusted by a conference, and though Luther was opposed, consent was at last secured, and October 1, 1529, saw Luther and Melanchthon met face to face with Zwingli and Ecolampadius, in Philip's castle in Marburg. With them were a number of the lesser leaders of both parties. During the succeeding days the Marburg colloquy ran its course. Luther was somewhat suspicious of the soundness of the Swiss on the doctrines of the Trinity and original sin, but the real point of difference was the presence or absence of Christ's physical body in the supper. Luther held firmly to the literal interpretation of the words, "This is my body." Zwingli urged the familiar argument that a physical body could not be in two places at the same time. Agreement was impossible. Zwingli urged that both parties were, after all, Christian brethren, but Luther declared, "You have a different spirit than we." Yet Philip would not let the hope of a protective league thus vanish, and he persuaded the two parties to draw up 15 articles of faith. On 14 there was agreement. The 15th had to do with the supper, and here there was unanimity on all save the one point as to the nature of Christ's presence, where the differences were stated. These Marburg articles both sides now signed with the provision that each should show Christian love to the other as far as the conscience of each may permit. Luther and Zwingli each left Marburg with the conviction that he was the victor. On the way home Luther prepared a somewhat more pointed series of articles, the Schwabach articles, on the basis of those of Marburg. Their greatest significance for the development of Lutheranism is, perhaps, the declaration that the Church is nothing else than believers in Christ who hold, believe, and teach the above enumerated articles. The original Lutheran conception of a church composed of those justified by their faith, had become transformed into that of those who not only have faith but accept a definite and exact doctrinal statement. These Schwabach articles were now made by the Elector of Saxony and the Margrave of Brandenburg-Ansbach the test of political confederacy. Only Nuremberg of the great South German cities would accept them. The defensive league of evangelicals which Philip had hoped, was impossible. The Lutherans and the Swiss each went their own way, for the division was permanent. In January, 1530, the Emperor sent the call from Italy, where he was about to be crowned by the Pope, for a Reichstag to meet in Augsburg. With unexpected friendliness, while declaring the adjustment of religious differences to be a main object of its meeting, he promised a kindly hearing for all representations. That demanded of the Protestants a statement of their beliefs and of their criticisms of the older practice, and these they now set about to prepare. Luther, Melanchthon, Bugenhagen, and Jonas drew up their criticisms of Roman practices, which, as worked over by Melanchthon, constitute the second, or negative, part of the Augsburg Confession, and a little later Melanchthon prepared its affirmative articles, which form the first part. On June 25, 1530, it was read to the Emperor in German. It bore the approving signatures of Elector John of Saxony, his heir, John Frederick, Margrave George of Brandenburg-Ansbach, Dukes Ernst and Franz of Brunswick-Leinburg, Landgrave Philip of Hesse, Wolfgang of Anhalt, and of the representatives of Nuremberg and Reutlingen. Before the close of the Reichstag the cities of Heilbronn, Kempten, Weissenberg, and Winsheim also. Ursel priesthood of believers is not mentioned. Yet Melanchthon gave a thoroughly Protestant tone to the confession as a whole. Justification by faith is admirably defined, the Protestant notes of the Church made evident, invocation of saints, the Mass, denial of the cup, monastic vows, and prescribed fasting rejected. To the Emperor Zwingli sent a vigorous expression of his views, which received scanty attention. A more significant event was the presentation of a joint confession by the Zwinglian-inclined South German cities, Strasbourg, Constance, Memmingen, and Lindau, the Confessio Tetrapolitana, largely from the pen of Butzer, in which a position intermediate between that of the Zwinglians and Lutherans was maintained. The papal legate, Cardinal Campeggio, advised plus that the confession be examined by Roman theologians present in Augsburg. This the emperor approved, and chief among these experts was Luther's old opponent, Eck. Melanchthon was willing to make concessions that would have ruined the whole Lutheran cause, but fortunately for it the evangelical princes were of sterner stuff. The Catholic theologians prepared a confutation, which was sent back to them by the emperor and Catholic princes as too polemic, and was at last presented to the Reichstag in much milder form on August 3. The emperor still hoped for reconciliation, and committees of conference were now appointed, but their work was vain, a result to which Luther's firmness largely contributed. The Catholic majority voiced the decision of the Reichstag that the Lutherans had been duly confuted, that they be given till April 15, 1531, to conform, that combined action be had against Zwinglians and Anabaptists, and that a general council be sought within a year to heal abuses in the Church. The reconstituted imperial law court should decide, in Catholic interest, cases of secularization. The Lutherans protested, declared their confession not refuted, and called attention to Melanchthon's apology, or defense of the confession, which he had hastily prepared when the vanity of concessions was at last becoming apparent even to him. That apology, rewritten and published the next year, 1531, was to be one of the classics of Lutheranism. Such a situation demanded defensive union. Even Luther, who had held it a sin to oppose the emperor by force, now was willing to leave the rightfulness of such resistance to the decision of the lawyers. At Christmas the Lutheran princes assembled in Schmalkalden and laid the foundations of a league. Butzer, whose union efforts were unremitting, persuaded Strasbourg to accept the Augsburg Confession, an example which had great effect on other South German cities. Finally, on February 27, 1531, the Schmalkaldic League was completed. Electoral Saxony, Hesse, Brunswick, Anhalt, and Mansfeld stood in defensive agreement with the cities Strasbourg, Constance, Ulm, Reutlingen, Memmingen, Lindau, Isny, Biberach, Magdeburg, Bremen, and Liebeck. Strong as the position of Charles V appeared on the surface, it was not so in reality in the face of this united opposition. The Catholic princes were jealous of one another and of the emperor. The Pope feared a general council. France was still to be reckoned with. The fatal day April 15, 1531, therefore passed without the threatened result. In October, 1531, the death of Zwingli at Kappel, Ante, page 365, deprived Swiss evangelicalism of its vigorous head, and inclined South German Protestantism to closer union with that of Wittenberg. The spring of 1532 brought a new danger to the empire as a whole, that of Turkish invasion. In 1529 the Turks had besieged Vienna, and before their advance religious differences had, in a measure, to give way. On July 23, 1532, the Emperor and the Schmalkaldic League agreed to the Truce of Nuremberg, by which all existing lawsuits over secularizations should be dropped and peace was assured to the Protestants until a general council, or at least a new Reichstag, should as in general were peaceable, if rather ignorant, people, of great religious earnestness, and patient endurance in persecution. The Meinster episode was not typical of them as a whole. Yet there were among them many radicals of whom Hans Hut, Ante, page 369, was an early example. Such a leader was Melchior Hoffmann. At first a devoted Lutheran, he became an equally earnest Anabaptist, with added claims to prophetic inspiration. His great success was in Friesland. He declared that Strasbourg had been divinely designated as the New Jerusalem, where he, as the prophet of the new dispensation, should suffer imprisonment for 6 months, but with 1533 the end of the world would come, and all who opposed the saints be destroyed. In this faith he went to Strasbourg, and his prophecy was so far fulfilled that he was there imprisoned, and in prison he remained till his death in 1543. Hoffman's apocalyptic preaching won many disciples in the Netherlands. One of these, Jan Matthys, a baker of Haarlem, gave himself forth as the prophet Enoch, and soon spread a fanatical propaganda widely through the Netherlands and adjacent parts of Germany. Unlike Hoffman, who would wait for the power of God to bring in the new age, Matthys would inaugurate it by force. Popular democratic discontent gave him his opportunity. Nowhere was this new teaching more influential than in Münster, where Bernd Rothman, the evangelical preacher, was won for radical views in January, 1534. Thither came Matthys soon after, and a tailor of Leiden, Jan Buckelsen. It was now asserted that God had rejected Strasbourg by reason of its unbelief, and chosen Münster as the New Jerusalem in its stead. Radicals flocked thither in large numbers. In February, 1534, they gained the mastery of the city, and drove out those who would not accept the new order. The Bishop of Münster laid siege to the city. Matthys was killed in battle. Jan Buckelsen was proclaimed king. Polygamy was established, community of goods enforced, all opponents bloodily put down. The struggle, though heroically maintained, was hopeless. The bishop, aided by Catholic and Lutheran troops, captured the city on June 24, 1535, and the surviving leaders were put to death by extreme torture. For German Anabaptism it was a catastrophe. Such fanaticism was popularly supposed to be characteristic of the Anabaptists, and the name became one of ignominy. For Lutheranism it was a gain. It freed the Lutheran cause from the Anabaptist rivalry, but it made Lutheranism even more positively than before a party of princely and middle-class sympathies. As for the Anabaptist movement itself, it came, especially in the Netherlands, under the wise, peace-loving, anti-fanatical leadership of Menno Simons, 1492–1559, to whom its worthy reorganization was primarily due, and from whom the term Mennonite is derived. Charles V had never ceased to hope and to labor for a general council, by which the divisions of the Church could be healed and administrative reforms effected. From Clement VII he could not secure it. Paul III, 1534–1549, who succeeded Clement, though by no means a single-hearted religious man, had much more appreciation than Clement of the gravity of the situation caused by the Reformation. He promptly appointed as cardinals Gasparo Contarini, 1483–1542, Jacopo Sadoleto, 1477–1547, Reginald Pole, 1500–1558, and Giovanni Pietro Carafa, 1476–1559, all men desirous of reform in morals, zeal, and administration, who laid before the Pope, in 1538, extensive recommendations for ecclesiastical betterments. By Paul II a general council was actually called to meet in Mantua in 1537. Before the date set, the new war between Charles V and Francis I of France, 1536–1538, had made its assembly impossible. Charles had set his heart on the council, and before the time that it should have opened he demanded of the Protestant leaders assembled in Schmalkalden, in February, 1537, that they agree to take part. The imperial order put. Political strength could first be reduced. That union of Protestant interests was no less a peril to imperial authority in political concerns. It was breaking hopelessly what little unity was left in the empire. Charles, therefore, slowly and with many hesitations, developed his great plan. He would have a general council in being. He would so reduce the strength of Protestantism by force that the Protestants would accept the council as a final arbiter, and the council could then make such minor concessions as would be needful for the reunion of Christendom, and correct such abuses as Protestants and Catholics alike condemned. To realize this plan he must secure 3 preliminary results. He must, if possible, divide the Schmalkaldic League politically, he must ward off danger of French attack, and the ever-threatening peril of Turkish invasion must, for a time at least, be minimized. The emperor's purpose of dividing the Protestants was aided by one of the most curious episodes of Reformation history. Landgrave Philip of Hesse, the political genius of the Schmalkaldic League, though sacrificial in devotion to the Protestant cause, was, like most princes of that age, a man of low personal morality. Though married early to a daughter of Duke George of Saxony, who bore him 7 children, he had no affection for her. His constant adulteries troubled his conscience to the extent that, from 1526 to 1539 he partook of the Lord's Supper but once. He grew anxious as to his soul's salvation, without improving his conduct. For some years he entertained the thought of a second marriage as a solution of his perplexities. The Old Testament worthies had practiced polygamy. The New Testament nowhere expressly forbade it. Why should not he? This reasoning was strengthened by acquaintance with Margaret von der Sale, an attractive 17-year-old daughter of a lady of his sister's little court. The mother's consent was won on condition that the Elector and the Duke of Saxony, and some others should be informed that it was to be a real marriage. Philip's first wife also consented. Philip was fully persuaded himself of the rightfulness of the step, but for the sake of public opinion, he desired the approval of the Wittenberg theologians. He therefore sent for Butzer of Strasbourg, whom he partly persuaded, partly frightened with threats of seeking dispensation from the emperor or the pope, into full support of his plan. Butzer now became Philip's messenger to Luther and Melanchthon, and to the Saxon elector, though the matter was presented as an abstract question, without mention of the person with whom marriage was contemplated. On December 10, 1539, Luther and Melanchthon gave their opinion. Polygamy they declared to be contrary to the primal law of creation, which Christ had approved, but a special case required oftentimes treatment which did not conform to the general rule. If Philip could not reform his life, it would be better to marry as he proposed than to live as he was doing. The marriage should, however, be kept absolutely a secret, so that the second wife should appear to be a concubine. The advice was thoroughly bad, though the Wittenberg reformers seem to have been moved by a sincere desire to benefit Philip's soul. Philip was more honorable than the advice. On March 4, 1540, he married Margaret in what, though private, cannot be called secret fashion. A court preacher performed the ceremony, and Melanchthon, Butzer, and a representative of the Saxon elector were among the witnesses. Though an attempt was made to keep the affair private, that soon proved impossible. Luther could only advise, a good strong lie, but Philip was manly enough to declare, I will not lie. The scandal was great, both among Protestants and Catholics. The other evangelical princes would not defend Philip's act or promise protection from its results. The emperor saw in it his opportunity. On June 13, 1541, he secured an agreement from Philip, as the loan for the Protestant cause. Fortune favored Charles in the rest of his program. Paul III was persuaded to call the General Council to meet in Trent, a town then belonging to the Empire, but practically Italian, in 1542. War caused a postponement, but in December, 1545, it at last actually began its sessions, which were to run a checkered and interrupted course till 1563. By vague, but indefinite, promises Charles secured, at the Reichstag in Speyer in 1544, the passive support of the Protestants, and some active assistance, for the wars against France and the Turks. The campaign against France was brief. The Emperor, in alliance with Henry VIII of England, pushed on nearly to Paris, when, to the surprise of Europe, he made peace with the French king, without, apparently, gaining any of the advantages in his grasp. Really, he had eliminated French interference in possible aid of German Protestantism for the immediate future. The Turks, busy with a war in Persia, and internal quarrels, made a truce with the emperor in October, 1545. All seemed to have worked together for his blow against German Protestantism. It was while prospects were thus darkening that Luther died on a visit to Eilben, the town in which he was born, on February 18, 1546, in consequence of an attack of heart disease or apoplexy. His last years had been far from happy. His health had long been wretched. The quarrels of the reformers, to which he had contributed his full share, distressed him. Above all, the failure of the pure preaching of justification by faith alone greatly to transform the social, civic, and political life about him grieved him. He was comforted by a happy home life and by full confidence in his gospel. The work which he had begun had passed far beyond the power of any one man, however gifted, to control. He was no longer needed, but his memory must always be that of one of the most titanic figures in the history of the Church. Before actually entering on the war, Charles succeeded yet further in dividing the Protestants. Ducal Saxony had become fully Protestant under Duke Heinrich, 1539–1541, but his short reign had been followed by the accession of his young son, Moritz, 1541–1553. Of great political abilities, Moritz was a character difficult to estimate, because in an age dominated by professed religious motives, however in reality oftentimes political, he cared nothing for the religious questions involved and everything for his own political advancement. Though son-in-law of Philip of Hesse and cousin of Elector John Frederick of Saxony, 1532–1547, Moritz had quarrelled with the Elector and was not on very good terms with Philip. The Emperor now, in June, 1546, secured his support secretly, by the promise of the transfer to Moritz of his cousin's electoral dignity in case of successful war, and other important concessions. Thus at length prepared, the Emperor declared John Frederick and Philip under ban for disloyalty to the Empire. Charles desired the war to seem political rather than religious. The Schmalkaldic League had made no adequate preparations. Mburit's defection was a great blow. Though at first the campaign went well for the Protestants, electoral Saxony was crushed at the Battle of Meilberg on the Elbe, on April 24, 1547, in which John Frederick was captured. Philip saw the cause was hopeless and surrendered himself to the Emperor. Both princes were imprisoned. Moritz received the electoral title and half his cousin's territories. Politically Protestantism was crushed. Only a few northern cities, of which Magdeburg was the chief, and a few minor northern princes still offered resistance. Yet, curiously enough, the emperor who had just crushed Protestantism politically had never been on worse terms with the Pope. Paul III had aided him early in the war, but had drawn back fearing that the successful emperor might grow too powerful. Charles wished the Council of Trent to move slowly till he had the Protestants. The Catholic princes refused to accept it as applying to them. The Pope denounced it. Charles had to abandon hope of making it a temporary reunion program, but secured its adoption on June 30, 1548, by the Reichstag in Augsburg as applying to the ex-Protestants. This Augsburg interim he now proceeded to enforce with a heavy hand. Moritz of Saxony had done such service to the imperial cause that a modification, known as the Leipzig interim, was allowed in his lands. It asserted justification by faith alone, but re-established much of Roman usage and government. To it Melanchthon reluctantly consented, regarding its Roman parts as adiaphora, or non-essential matter. For this weakness he was bitterly denounced by the defiant Lutherans of unconquered Magdeburg, notably by Matthias Flacius Illyricus, 1520–1575, and Nikolaus von Amsdorf, 1483–1565. Flacius, especially, did much to maintain popular Lutheranism in this dark time, but the bitter quarrels among Lutheran theologians had begun. Yet, superficially, it seemed as if Charles was nearing his goal. Pope Paul III died in 1549, and was succeeded by Julius III, 1550–1555, who proved more tractable to the emperor. The new pope summoned a council to meet once more in Trent, and Protestant theologians actually appeared before it in 1552. Really, Germany was profoundly disaffected, the Protestants groaning under the imperial yoke, and the Catholic princes jealous of Charles's increased power and of his apparently successful attempt to secure the imperial succession ultimately for his son, later to be famous as Philip II of Spain. Moritz of Saxony was dissatisfied that his father-in-law, Philip of Hesse, was still imprisoned. He felt, moreover, that he had secured all he could hope for from the emperor, that his subjects were Lutheran, and that only as a Lutheran leader against the emperor, could his boundless ambition be further gratified. The reduction of defiant Magdeburg, in the name of the emperor, gave Moritz excuse for raising an army. Agreements were made with the Lutheran princes of northern Germany. The aid of King Henry II of France, 1547 to 1559, was secured at the price of the surrender to France of the German border cities of Metz, Toul, and Verdun. Charles knew the plot, but took no adequate steps to meet it. The blow came swiftly. Henry invaded Lorraine and took the coveted cities. Moritz marched rapidly southward, almost capturing the emperor, who escaped by flight from Innsbruck. The whole structure that Charles had so laboriously built up toppled like a card house, not so much before the power of Lutheranism as before the territorial independence of the princes. On August 2, 1552, the Treaty of Passau brought the brief struggle to an end. By the Treaty of Passau the settlement of the religious question was referred to the next Reichstag. That body was not able to meet till 3 years later. Princely rivalries distracted Germany. Moritz lost his life in warfare against the lawless Margrave Albrecht of Brandenburg in 1553. Charles, conscientiously unwilling to tolerate Protestantism, but seeing such toleration inevitable, handed over full authority to treat to his brother Ferdinand, though the latter was not to be chosen emperor till 1558. The Reichstag met in Augsburg. The Lutherans demanded full rights, and possession of all ecclesiastical property, heretofore or hereafter secularized. They asked toleration for Lutherans in all Catholic territories, but proposed to grant none to Catholics in their own. These extreme demands were naturally resisted, and the result was a compromise, the Peace of Augsburg, of September 25, 1555. By its provisions equal rights in the empire were extended to Catholics and Lutherans, no other evangelicals were recognized. Each lay prince should determine which of the two faiths should be professed in his territory. No choice was allowed his subjects, and but one faith should be permitted in a given territory. This was the principle. Had the Catholic conception of visible unity. The older leaders were rapidly passing. Luther had died 9 years before. Melanchthon was to live till 1560. Charles V was to resign his possession of the Netherlands in 1555, and of Spain a year later, and seek retirement at Yuste in Spain till death came to him in 1558. Section 6. The Scandinavian lands Denmark, Norway, and Sweden had been nominally united under one sovereign since the Union of Kalmar, in 1397. Since 1460, Schleswig-Holstein had also been under Danish control. In none of these lands was the crown powerful. In all, the great ecclesiastics were unpopular as oppressive, and often foreign-born, and in all they were in rivalry with the nobility. In no portion of Europe, not even in England, was the Reformation to be more thoroughly political. At the dawn of the Reformation the Danish throne was occupied by Christian II, 1513-1523, an enlightened despot of Renaissance sympathies. He saw the chief evil of his kingdom in the power of the nobles and ecclesiastics, and to limit that of the bishops by introducing the Lutheran movement he secured a Lutheran preacher in the person of Martin Reinhard, in 1520, and an advisor in Karlstadt for a brief time in 1521. Partially at least through the latter's counsels, and law of 1521 forbade appeals to Rome, reformed the monasteries, limited the authority of the bishops, and permitted priestly marriage. Opposition prevented its execution, and the hostility of the privileged classes, which Christian II had roused in many ways, drove him from his throne in 1523, and made his uncle, Frederick I, 1523-1533, king in his stead. Though inclined to Lutheranism, Frederick was forced by the parties which had put him on the throne to promise to respect the privileges of the nobles and prevent any heretical preaching. Yet Lutheranism penetrated the land. In Hans Tausen, 1494-1561, a one-time monk and former Wittenberg student, it found a preacher of popular power from 1524 onward. The year before, a Danish translation of the New Testament had been published. By 1526, King Frederick took Tausen under protection as his chaplain. The same year the king took the confirmation of the appointment of bishops into his own hands. A law of 1527 enacted this into statute, granted toleration to Lutherans, and permitted priestly marriage. These changes were aided by the support of a large section of the nobility won by the king's countenance of their attacks on ecclesiastical rights and property. In 1580, the same year as the Augsburg Confession, Tausen and his associates laid before the Danish parliament the 43 Copenhagen Articles. No decision was reached at the time, but Lutheran SM made increasing progress till Frederick's demise in 1533. The death of Frederick left all in confusion. Of his two sons, most of the nobles favored the elder, Christian III, 1536–1559, a determined Lutheran, while the bishop supported the younger, Johann. A distracting period of civil conflict followed, from which Christian III emerged the victor in 1536. The bishops were imprisoned, their authority abolished, and church property confiscated for the crown. Christian now called on Wittenberg for aid. Johann Bugenhagen, Luther's associate, came in 1537, and 7 new Lutheran superintendents, named by the king, but retaining the title, bishop, were ordained by the German reformer, who was himself a presbyter. The Danish church was now reorganized in fully Lutheran fashion. Norway was a separate kingdom, but by election under the Danish king. The Reformation scarcely touched the land during the reign of Frederick I. In the struggles that followed, Archbishop Olaf Engelbrektsson of Trondheim, the head of the Norwegian clergy, led a temporizing party and fled the land on Christian III's success. Norway was made a Danish province, and the new Danish Lutheran religious constitution was nominally introduced. Effective preaching and superintendence in Norway was, Hauaf. Ruler was Gustav Trolle, Archbishop of Ups. Gustav procured from Pope Leo X approval of the excommunication of his opponents, though that opposition was purely political. In 1520 Christian II captured Stockholm and followed his coronation as King of Sweden by a deed of the utmost cruelty. He had the unsuspecting nobles, gathered for the ceremony, executed, nominally as excommunicated heretics. The Stockholm bath of blood roused Sweden to a rebellion against Christian II, which soon found an energetic leader in Gustav Vasa. The Danes were expelled and, in 1523, Gustav was chosen king, 1523–1560. Meanwhile Lutheran doctrine was being taught by two brothers, who had returned in 1519 from studies in Wittenberg, Olaf, 1497–1552, and Lars Peterson, 1499–1573, who labored in Strängnäs, and soon won the archdeacon, Lars Andersson, 1482–1552. By 1524 King Gustav was definitely favoring these leaders. Andersson became his chancellor, and Lars Peterson professor of theology in UPS. On December 27, 1524, a discussion in UPS between Olaf Peterson, now preacher in Stockholm, and the Roman champion, Peter Gall, seemed a victory for the reformers. Part of the support of the king was probably due to religious conviction, but no small portion was owing to the dire poverty of the crown, which Gustav thought could be remedied only by extensive confiscation of church property. In June, 1527, the king struck the blow. At the Diet of Westerius Gustav demanded and obtained by threat of resignation, the assignment to the crown of all episcopal or monastic property which the king should deem not needed for proper religious work, the surrender to the heirs of the original owners of all lands exempt from taxes acquired by the Church since 1454, and pure preaching of God's Word. Provision was made for the reconstitution of the Church under royal authority. 2 Though master of the Swedish Church, and now possessor of a large part of its property, Gustav used his power in religion conservatively. Most of the old prelates left the land. The bishop's office was retained, though its holders were now appointed by the king. New bishops were consecrated, with the old rites, in 1528, at the hands of Bishop Peter Magni, of Västerås, who had received his office in Catholic days, and through whom apostolical succession was believed to be transmitted to the Swedish Lutheran episcopate. Further reform measures were taken by the Synod of Örebro in 1529.3. A Swedish service was issued in 1529, and the Swedish Mass, in 1531. In the year last named Lars Peterson was made Archbishop of Ups, though without jurisdiction over his fellow bishops that remained in the hands of the king. Most of the lower clergy accepted the Reformation and kept their places, but such changes by royal power were far from winning immediate popular approval, and it was long before Sweden became thoroughly evangelical. Its type of Lutheranism in doctrine and practice was strongly conservative. The reform of Sweden carried with it that of Finland, then part of the Swedish monarchy. The Swedish church was to pass through a period of Romanizing reaction, especially under the reign of Gustav's son, Johann III, 1569-1592, but it was ended in 1593, when the Synod of UPS formally adopted the Augsburg Confession as the Creed of Sweden. Section 7. Revolt in French Switzerland and Geneva. Before Calvin, Zurich was the strongest power in northern Switzerland, Bern in the south. The latter was in constant rivalry with the Dukes of Savoy, especially for possession of French-speaking territories in the neighborhood of Lake Geneva. The acceptance of evangelical views by Bern on February 7, 1528, ante, page 863, led the Bernese government to further the introduction of the Reformation into these dependent districts by encouraging the preaching of Guillaume Farel, 1489–1565. Farel was a native of Gap, in the French province of Dauphiné. As a student in Paris he came under the influence of the Egan, a stormy attack in Neuchâtel, in November, 1529, which ultimately secured the victory of the Reformation there. Murat followed in 1530, Degree but in Grandson and Orbe, which, like Murat, were under the joint overlordship of Protestant Bern and Catholic Freiburg. He could secure only the toleration of both forms of worship. Ta visit by invitation in September, 1532, to a synod of the Waldenses in the high valleys of the Cotillon Alps resulted in the acceptance of the Reformation by a large section of the body and was followed in October by an attempt, at first unsuccessful, to preach reform in Geneva. Everywhere Farel faced opposition with undaunted courage, sometimes at the risk of life and at the cost of bodily injury, but no one could be indifferent in his strenuous presence. Geneva, at Farel's coming, was in the struggle of a revolutionary crisis. Situated on a main trade route across the Alps, it was an energetic business community, keenly alive to its interests and liberties, of rather easygoing moral standards, in spite of its extensive monasteries and ecclesiastical foundations. Jean van liberties were being maintained with great difficulty against the encroachments of the powerful Duke of Savoy. At the beginning of the 16th century three powers shared the government of the city and its adjacent villages, the bishop, his vicediminus, or temporal administrator, and the citizens, who met annually in a general assembly and chose 4 syndics and a treasurer. Besides the general assembly, the citizens were ruled by a little council of 25, of which the syndics of the year and of the year previous were members. Questions of larger policy were discussed by a council of 60 appointed by the Little Council, and in 1527 a council of 200 was added, its membership including the Little Council and 175 others chosen by that inner body. The aggressive Dukes of Savoy had appointed the vicediminus since 1290, and had controlled the bishopric since 1444. The struggle was therefore won for freedom by the citizens against Savoyard interests, represented by the bishop and the cedominus. In 1519 the Jean-Van citizens made a protective alliance with Freiburg, but Duke Charles III of Savoy won the upper hand, and the Jean-Van patriot Philibert Berthelier was beheaded. 7 years later Geneva renewed the effort, this time entering into alliance with Bern as well as Freiburg. In 1527 the bishop, Pierre de la Baume, left the city, which he could not control, and fully attached himself to the Savoyard interests. The authority of the vicediminus was repudiated. Duke Charles attacked the plucky city, but Bern and Freiburg came to its aid in October, 1530, and he had to pledge respect to Jean van liberties. Thus far there was little sympathy with the Reformation in Geneva, but Bern was Protestant and was anxious to see the evangelical faith there established. Placards criticizing papal claims and presenting Reformed doctrine were posted on June 9, 1532, but Geneva's ally, Freiburg, was Catholic, and the Jean Van government disowned any leanings toward Lutheranism. 2 In October following Farel came, as has been seen, but could get no footing in the city. Farel sent his friend Antoine Froment, 1508–1581, to Geneva, who found a place there as a schoolmaster, and propagated Reformed doctrine under this protection. On January 1, 1533, Froment was emboldened to preach publicly, though the result was a riot. By the following Easter there were enough Protestants to dare to observe the Lord's Supper, and in December Farel effectively returned. The Jean Van government was in a difficult position. Its Catholic ally, Freiburg, demanded that Farel be silenced. Its Protestant ally, Bern, insisted on the arrest of Guy Furbity, the chief defender of the Roman cause. Farel and his friends held a public disputation, and on March 1, 1534, seized a church. Under Bernese pressure the government broke the league with ca. Hourfully to its aid in January, 1536. Geneva saw the peril from Savoy removed, only to have danger arise of falling under Bernese control. Yet the courage of its citizens was equal to the situation, and on August 7, 1536, Bern acknowledged Jean van Independence Point II. The courageous city was now free, and had accepted Protestantism, more for political than for religious reasons. Its religious institutions had all to be formed anew. Farel felt himself unequal to the task, and in July, 1536, he constrained a young French acquaintance passing through the city to stay and aid in the work. The friend was John Calvin. John Calvin was born in Noyon, a city of Picardy, about 58 miles northeast of Paris, on July 10, 1509. His father, Gerard Calvin, was a self-made man, who had risen to the posts of secretary of the Noyon bishopric and attorney for its cathedral chapter, and possessed the friendship of the powerful noble family of Hengist, which gave 2 bishops to Noyon in his lifetime. With the younger members of this family John Calvin was intimately acquainted, and this friendship earned for him a familiarity with the ways of polite society such as few of the reformers enjoyed. Through the father's influence the son received the income from certain ecclesiastical posts in and near Noyon, the earliest being assigned him before the age of 12. He was never ordained. Thus provided with means, Calvin entered the University of Paris in August, 1523, enjoying the remarkable instruction in Latin given by Mathurin Cordier, 1479–1564, to whom he owed the foundation of a style of great brilliancy. Continuing his course with special emphasis, as was then the custom, on philosophy and dialectics, Calvin completed his undergraduate studies early in 1528. As a student he formed a number of warm friendships, notably with the family of Guillaume Copp, the king's physician, and an eager supporter of humanism. Calvin's father had designed him for theology, but by 1527 Gerard Calvin was in quarrel with the Noyon Cathedral chapter and determined that his son should study law. For that discipline Calvin now went to the University of Orleans, where Pierre de l'Estoile, 1480–1537, enjoyed great fame as a jurist, and in 1529 to the University of Bourges, to listen to Andrea Alciati, 1493–1550. Humanistic interests, also, strongly attracted him, and he began Greek in Bourges with the aid of a German teacher, Melchior Woolmer, 1496–1561. He graduated in law, but the death of his father, in 1531, left Calvin his own master, and he now took up the study of Greek and Hebrew in the Humanist College de France, which King Francis I had founded in Paris in 1530. He was hard at work on his first book, his commentary on Seneca's treatise on clemency, which was published in April, 1532. It was a marvel of erudition, and marked no less by a profound sense of moral values, but in it Calvin displayed no interest in the religious questions of the age. He was still simply an earnest, deeply learned humanist. Yet it was not for want of opportunity to know the new doctrines that Calvin was still untouched by the struggle. Humanism had done its preparatory work in France as elsewhere. Its most conspicuous representative had been Jacques Lefebvre of Étaples, 1455–1536, who made his home in the monastery of St. Germain-des-Prés in Paris, from 1507, for some years, and gathered about him a notable group of disciples. Lefebvre never broke or wished to break with the Roman Church, but in 1512 he published a commentary on Paul's epistles, which denied the justifying merit of good works, declared salvation the free gift of God, and held to the sole authority of Scripture. It was the study of a quiet scholar and aroused no sensation at the time. 11 years later, in 1523, he put forth a translation of the New Testament. Among his pupils were Guillaume Briçonnet, 1470–1534, from 1516 Bishop of Meaux, Guillaume Bude, 1467–1540, to whose persuasions the establishment of Reform, but there was no ignorance of what the main questions were in the scholarly circle in which Calvin moved. They had not as yet become important for him, Between the publication of his commentary on Seneca's treatise on clemency in the spring of 1532 and the autumn of 1533, Calvin experienced a sudden conversion. Of its circumstances nothing is certainly known, but its central experience was that God spoke to him through the Scriptures and God's will must be obeyed. Religion had henceforth the first place in his thoughts. How far he even yet thought of breaking with the Roman Church is doubtful. He was still a member of the humanistic circle in Paris, of which Roussel and his intimate friend Nicolas Cop were leaders. 2 On November 1, 1533, Cop delivered an inaugural address as newly elected rector of the University of Paris, in which he pleaded for reform, using language borrowed from Erasmus and Luther. That Calvin wrote the oration, as has often been alleged, is improbable, but he undoubtedly sympathized with its sentiments. The commotion aroused was great, and King Francis enjoined action against the Lutherers. Cop and Calvin had to seek safety, which Calvin found in the home of a friend, Louis du Tillet, in Angoulême. Calvin's sense of the necessity of separation from the older communion was now rapidly developing, and forced him to go to Noyon to resign his benefices on May 4, 1534. Here he was for a brief time imprisoned. Though soon released, France was too perilous for him, especially after Antoine Marcourt posted his injudicious theses against the Mass in October, 1534. And by about New Year's following, Calvin was safely in Protestant Basel. Marcourt's placards had been followed by a sharp renewal of persecution, one of the victims being Calvin's friend the Parisian merchant, Estienne de la Forge. Francis I was coquetting for the aid of German Protestants against Charles V, and therefore, to justify French persecutions, issued a public letter in February, 1535, charging French Protestantism with anarchistic aims such as no government could bear. Calvin felt that he must defend his slandered fellow believers. He therefore rapidly completed a work begun in Angoulême, and published it in March, 1536, as his Institutes, prefacing it with a letter to the French king. The letter is one of the literary masterpieces of the Reformation age. Courteous and dignified, it is a tremendously forceful presentation of the Protestant position and defense of its holders against the royal slanders. No French Protestant had yet spoken with such clearness, restraint, and power, and with it its author of 26 years stepped at once into the leadership of French Protestantism. The Institutes themselves, to which this letter was prefixed, were, as published in 1536, far from the extensive treatise into which they were to grow in Calvin's final edition of 1559, but they were already the most orderly and systematic popular presentation of doctrine and of the Christian life that the Reformation produced. Calvin's mind was formulative rather than creative. Without Luther's antecedent labors his work could not have been done. It is Luther's conception of justification by faith, and of the sacraments as seals of God's promises that he presents. Much he derived from Butzer, notably his emphasis on the glory of God as that for which all things are created, on election as a doctrine of Christian confidence, and on the consequences of election as a strenuous endeavor after a life of conformity to the will of God. But all is systematized and clarified with a skill that was Calvin's own. Man's highest knowledge, Calvin taught, is that of God and of himself. Enough comes by nature to leave man without excuse, but adequate knowledge is given only in the Scriptures, which the witness of the Spirit in the heart of the believing reader attests as the very voice of God. These Scriptures teach that God is good, and the source of all good are in Christ. This new life of faith is salvation, but it is salvation unto righteousness. That the believer now does works pleasing to God is the proof that he has entered into vital union with Christ. We are justified not without, and yet not by works. Calvin thus left room for a conception of works as strenuous as any claimed by the Roman Church, though very different in relation to the accomplishment of salvation. The standard set before the Christian is the law of God, as contained in the Scriptures, not as a test of his salvation but as an expression of that will of God which as an already saved man he will strive to fulfill. This emphasis on the law as the guide of Christian life was peculiarly Calvin's own. It has made Calvinism always insistent on character, though in Calvin's conception man is saved to character rather than by character. A prime nourishment of the Christian life is by prayer. Since all good is of God, and man is unable to initiate or resist his conversion, it follows that the reason some are saved and others are lost is the divine choice, election and reprobation. For a reason for that choice beyond the will of God it is absurd to inquire, since God's will is an ultimate fact. Yet to Calvin election was always primarily a doctrine of Christian comfort. That God had a plan of salvation for a man, individually, was an unshakable rock of confidence, not only for one convinced of his own unworthiness, but for one surrounded by opposing forces even if they were those of priests and kings. That made a man a fellow laborer with God in the accomplishment of God's will. 3 institutions have been divinely established by which the Christian life is maintained: the Church, the sacraments, and civil government. In the last analysis the Church consists of all the elect of God, but it also properly denotes the whole body of mankind, who profess to worship one God in Christ. Yet there is no true church where lying and falsehood have usurped the ascendancy. The New Testament shows as church officers, pastors, teachers, elders, and deacons, who enter on their charges with the assent of the congregation that they serve. Their call is twofold: the secret inclination from God and the approbation of the people. Calvin thus gave to the congregation a voice in the choice of its officers not accorded by any other Reformation party except that of the Anabaptists, though circumstances at Geneva were to compel him to regard that voice there as expressed by the city government. Similarly, Calvin claimed for the Church full and independent jurisdiction in discipline up to the point of excommunication. Further it could not go, but it was a retention of a freedom which all the other leaders of the Reformation had abandoned to state supervision. Civil government has, however, the divinely appointed task of fostering the Church, protecting it from false doctrine, and punishing offenders for whose crimes excommunication is insufficient. It was essentially the medieval theory of the relations of Church and State. Calvin recognized only 2 sacraments: baptism and the Lord's Supper. Regarding the burning question of Christ's presence in the supper, he stood, like Butzer, part way between Luther and Zwingli, nearer the Swiss reformer in form, and to the German in spirit. With Zwingli he denied any physical presence of Christ, yet he asserts in the clearest terms a real, though spiritual presence received by faith. Christ, out of the substance of his flesh, breathes life into our souls, nay, diffuses his own life into us, though the real flesh of Christ does not enter us. For on the publication of the Institutes in the spring of 1536, Calvin made a brief visit to the court of Ferrara, in Italy, doubtless intending to advance the evangelical cause with his liberal-minded and hospitable fellow countrywoman, the Duchess Renée. His stay was short, and a brief visit to France followed, to settle his business affairs and to Ations from Calvin's pen. These proposed monthly administration of the Lord's Supper. For better preparation, the city government should appoint certain persons, for each quarter of the city, who, in connection with the ministers, might report the unworthy to the Church for discipline up to excommunication. This was Calvin's first attempt to make Geneva a model community, and likewise to assert the independence of the Church in its own sphere. A second effort was the adoption of a catechism composed by Calvin, and a third the imposition on each citizen of a creed, probably written by Farel. These recommendations the little council adopted with considerable modification. The success of Calvin's work was soon threatened. He and Farel were unjustly charged with Arianism by Pierre Caroli, then of Lausanne. They vindicated their orthodoxy easily, but not till great publicity had been given to the matter. In Geneva itself the new discipline and the demand for individual assent to the new creed soon aroused bitter opposition. This was strong enough to secure a vote of the Council of 200, in January, 1538, that the supper should be refused to no one, thus destroying Calvin's system of discipline. The next month the opposition won the city election, and determined to force the issue. The Bernese liturgy differed somewhat from that now established in Geneva. Bern had long wished it adopted in Geneva, and the opposition now secured a vote that it be used. Calvin and Farel regarded the differences in Bernese and Jean Van usage as of slight importance, but an imposition by civil authority, without consulting the ministers, they viewed as robbing the Church of all freedom. Calvin and Farel refused compliance, and on April 23, 1538, were banished. Their work in Geneva seemed to have ended in total failure. After a vain attempt at restoration to Geneva by the intervention of Swiss Protestant authorities, Farel found a pastorate in Neuchâtel, which was thenceforth to be his home, and Calvin, at Butzer's invitation, a refuge in Strasbourg. The 3 years there spent were in many ways the happiest in Calvin's life. There he was pastor of a church of French refugees and lecturer on theology. There he was honored by the city and made one of its representatives in Charles V reunion debates between Protestants and Catholics, ante, page 376, gaining thereby the friendship of Melanchthon and other German reformers. There he married, in 1540, the wife who was to be his faithful companion till her death in 1549. There he found time for writing, not merely an enlarged edition of the Institutes, and his commentary on Romans, the beginning of a series that put him in the front rank of exegetes among the reformers, but his brilliant reply to Sadoleto, which was justly regarded as the ablest of vindications of Protestantism generally. Meanwhile a political revolution occurred in Geneva for which Calvin was in no way responsible. The party there which had secured his banishment made a disastrous treaty with Bern in 1539, which resulted in its overthrow the next year and the condemnation of the negotiators as traitors. The party friendly to Calvin was once more in power, and its leaders sought his return. He was with difficulty persuaded, but in 1541 was once more in Geneva, practically on his own terms. Calvin promptly secured the adoption of his new ecclesiastical constitution, the Ordonnances, now far more definite than the recommendations accepted in 1537. In spite of his successful return, however, he could not have them quite all that he wished. The ordinances declare that Christ has instituted in his church the 4 offices of pastor, teacher, elder, and deacon, and define the duties of each. Pastors were to meet weekly for public discussion, examination of ministerial candidates, and exegesis, in what was popularly known as the congregation. The teacher was to be the head of the Geneva school system, which Calvin regarded as an esse of his French congregation in Strasbourg, which, in turn, was essentially a translation of that generally in use in that German city. In formulating it for Jean Van use Calvin made a good many modifications to meet Jean Van customs or prejudices, it combined a happy union of fixed and free prayer. Calvin had none of the hostility against fixed forms which his spiritual descendants in Great Britain and America afterward manifested. It also gave full place to singing. Under Calvin's guidance, and he held no other office than that of one of the ministers of the city, much was done for education and for improved trade, but all Jean Van life was under the constant and minute supervision of the consistoire. Calvin would make Geneva a model of a perfected Christian community. Its strenuous evangelicalism attracted refugees in large numbers, many of them men of position, learning, and wealth, principally from France, but also from Italy, the Netherlands, Scotland, and England. These soon became a very important factor in Jean Van life. Calvin himself, and all his associated ministers, were foreigners. Opposition to his strenuous rule appeared practically from the first, but, by 1548, had grown very serious. It was made up of 2 elements, those to whom any discipline would have been irksome, and much more formidable, those of old Jean Van families who felt that Calvin, his fellow ministers, and the refugees were foreigners who were imposing a foreign yoke on a city of heroic traditions of independence. That there was a party of religious libertines in Geneva, is a baseless tradition. Calvin's severest struggle was from 1548 to 1555, from the time that some of the older inhabitants began to fear that they would be swamped politically by the refugees, till the refugees, almost all of whom were eager supporters of Calvin, achieved what had been dreaded, and made Calvin's position unshakable. Constantly increasing in fame outside of Geneva, Calvin stood in imminent peril, throughout this period, of having his Jean Van work overthrown. The cases of conflict were many, but 2 stand out with special prominence. The first was that caused by Jérémie Hermes Bolsec, a former monk of Paris, now a Protestant physician in Végy, near Geneva. In the congregation Bolsec charged Calvin with error in asserting predestination. That was to attack the very foundations of Calvin's authority, for his sole hold on Geneva was as an interpreter of the Scriptures. If he was not right in all, he was thoroughly discredited. Calvin took Bolsec's charges before the city government in October, 1551. The result was Bolsec's trial. The opinions of other Swiss governments were asked, and it was evident that they attached no such weight to predestination as did Calvin. It was with difficulty that Calvin procured Bolsec's banishment, and the episode led him to a more strenuous insistence of the vital importance of predestination as a Christian truth than even heretofore. As for Bolsec, he ultimately returned to the Roman communion and avenged himself on Calvin's memory by a grossly slanderous biography. Calvin was thus holding his power with difficulty, when in February, 1553, the elections, which for some years had been fairly balanced, turned decidedly in favor of his opponents. His fall seemed inevitable, when he was rescued and put on the path to ultimate victory by the arrival in Geneva of Miguel Servetus, whose case forms the second of those here mentioned. Servetus was a Spaniard, almost the same age as Calvin, and undoubtedly a man of great, though erratic, genius. In 1531 he published his De Trinitatis Erroribus. Compelled to conceal his identity, he studied medicine under the name of Villeneuve, being the real discoverer of the pulmonary circulation of the blood. He settled in Vienne in France, where he developed a large practice. He was working secretly on his Restitution of Christianity, which he published early in 1553. To his thinking, the Nicene doctrine of the and demanded that Calvin be exiled and Calvin's goods adjudged to him. The trial ended in Servetus's conviction and death by fire on October 27, 1553. Though a few voices of protest were raised, notably that of Sebastian Castellio, 1515–1563, of Basel, most men agreed with Melanchthon that it was justly done. However odious the trial and its tragic end may seem in retrospect, for Calvin it was a great victory. It freed the Swiss churches from any imputation of unorthodoxy on the doctrine of the Trinity, while Calvin's opponents had ruined themselves by making difficult the punishment of one whom the general sentiment of that age condemned. Calvin's improved status was soon apparent. The elections of 1554 were decidedly in his favor, those of 1555 yet more so. In January, 1555, he secured permanent recognition of the right of the consistoire to proceed to excommunication without governmental interference. The now largely Calvinist government proceeded, the same year, to make its position secure by admitting a considerable number of the refugees to the franchise. A slight riot on the evening of May 16, 1555, begun by Calvin's opponents, was seized as the occasion of executing and banishing their leaders as traitors. Henceforth the party favorable to Calvin was undisputed master of Geneva. Bern was still hostile, but the common danger to Bern and Geneva when Emmanuel Philibert, Duke of Savoy and victor for Spain over the French at St-Quentin in 1557, was enabled to lay claim to his duchy, then mostly in possession of the French, brought about a perpetual alliance, in January, 1558, in which Geneva stood for the first time on a full equality with its ally, Bern. Thus relieved of the most pressing perils, at home and abroad, Calvin crowned his Jean Van work by the foundation in 1559 of the Jean Van Academy, in reality, as it has long since become, the University of Geneva. It became immediately the greatest center of theological instruction in the Reformed communions, as distinguished from the Lutheran, and the great seminary from which ministers in numbers were sent forth not only to France but in less degree to the Netherlands, England, Scotland, Germany, and Italy. Calvin's influence extended far beyond Geneva. Thanks to his institutes, his pattern of church government in Geneva, his academy, his commentaries, and his constant correspondence, he molded the thought and inspired the ideals of the Protestantism of France, the Netherlands, Scotland, and the English Puritans. His influence penetrated Poland and Hungary, and before his death Calvinism was taking root in southwestern Germany itself. Men thought his thoughts after him. His was the only system that the Reformation produced that could organize itself powerfully in the face of governmental hostility, as in France and England. It trained strong men, confident in their election to be fellow workers with God in the accomplishment of His will, courageous to do battle, insistent on character, and confident that God has given in the Scriptures the guide of all right human conduct and proper worship. The spiritual disciples of Calvin, in most various lands, bore one common stamp. This was Calvin's work, a mastery of mind over mind, and certainly by the time of his death in Geneva, on May 27, 1564, he deserved the description of the only international reformer. Calvin left no successor of equal stature. The work had grown too large for any one man to direct. But in Geneva, and to a considerable extent in his labors beyond its borders, his mantle fell on the worthy shoulders of Theodore Beza, 15191605, a man of more conciliatory